It was a gray afternoon, the light in the hospital corridors suffocating between the cold walls. Thomas walked into Finn's office, not with the calm of a friend visiting, but with the pent-up anger of a soul disintegrating. It all started with a file accidentally falling out of a file when he went to Finn to ask about Douglas's test schedule. A thin piece of paper, the corner folded, but containing a secret that could erase all the trust he had ever held. When his eyes caught the name Hope Logan and the word termination in bold, Thomas's heart stopped for a moment, as if his entire body had frozen in midair. The truth was like a knife stabbing straight into the fragile remains of his trust. He stood there in the middle of the silent room, listening to his heartbeat mixed with the hum of the air conditioner, like the last sound of a collapsed world. Finn, realizing what was happening, immediately closed the file, his eyes confused, his voice hoarse with the pressure of professional responsibility. He knew the law, knew that he was not allowed to reveal personal information about patients, but Thomas had gone beyond the limits of reason. His rage made him forget all principles, forget shame. He began to throw questions like knives into the air, forcing Finn to react. Finn stepped back, trying to stay calm, trying to say things within the framework. But Thomas's eyes, the eyes full of hurt, made all words stop in midair. Because in those eyes was no longer a man in love with a woman, but a soul betrayed by the very person he believed was his savior. Thomas threatened, his voice low, broken, trembling with anger. Finn knew there was no way to avoid it. Even if it was a violation of medical principles, silence could push things further. Finn confessed, each word like a funeral drum on the cold table. Hope was pregnant 2 weeks before she married Liam. She asked for an abortion. No one knew. She didn't want this baby. And the paperwork was proof. The words thundered in Thomas's mind. He shook, images of the past 2 weeks overlapping the night Hope came to him, eyes wild, hands shaking in the rain, and the moment they crossed a line they should never have crossed. For him, it was real, a connection between two hearts that had been through so many lies. But for Hope, it turned out to be a mistake. A mistake. A stain to be wiped away before she put on her wedding dress. Thomas slumped in his chair, hands shaking, palms sweaty. In his mind, every memory of Hope was shattered into pieces. He remembered every detail, her smile, the light from the window illuminating her hair, the soft words he had once believed were real. Now, it was all an illusion. He began to have difficulty breathing, his heart pounding, as if someone were squeezing his chest. Outside, the wind blew through the trees, the rustling of leaves like the mocking laughter of fate. Thomas left the hospital, walking aimlessly, not knowing where he was going, only that he needed to get away from everyone before he exploded. A series of questions echoed in his mind. Had Hope ever loved him, or was he just a tool in her weakness? And if the child was really not his, why did she hide it? As night fell over Los Angeles, Thomas returned to his apartment, the lamplight reflecting off the walls in a dark yellow pattern like dried blood. He sat down at his desk and opened the sketchbook he had once reserved for Hope. Sketches for the collective collection, the soft curves he had once called love and yarn, but now each stroke was evidence of self-deception. He tore the paper into shreds, the pieces falling to the floor, melting into the darkness like ashes. In his mind, an image of Hope appeared, standing in the middle of the church, her white wedding dress, her gentle smile, and the child she had chosen not to keep. Finn, elsewhere, could not sleep either. He sat in his office, looking at the sealed patient records, his hand clenching a cold cup of coffee. He knew he had just violated his medical oath, but he also knew that Thomas's pain was nothing compared to Hope's torment. Because only someone who has fallen into the depths of sin knows what it feels like to be caught between what is right and what should be done. Finn looked out the window, where the moonlight fell on the courtyard, its light cold as metal. He wondered how many other secrets were buried in this hospital, how many truths were wrapped in sealed envelopes, waiting for a trembling hand to open them and blow someone's life away. Meanwhile, Hope stood alone in her bedroom, the light from the desk lamp casting a pale face. She looked into the mirror, her hand resting lightly on her stomach, as if by unconscious habit, where there had once been a life she had chosen to reject. No tears fell, only a vast void that swallowed all sound. She thought of Thomas, the man who had loved her with a fierceness she dared not face. To Hope, that love was too dangerous, too real, too close to addiction. Liam represented safety, the image of family she had always been taught to protect. But deep down she knew that what she had done was not choose love, but choose fear. Thomas didn't know that that night, Hope sat in the waiting room, her hands clutching the consent form, the cold feel of the metal on her skin making her shiver. She didn't look at anyone, didn't say anything. Just listened to the ultrasound machine beep like the last beat of something she didn't have the courage to keep. When she left the room, she didn't turn around. She thought that by doing so, she could bury it all. But nothing stays buried forever. The next day, Thomas went to Hope's house, but didn't say a word. He stood outside the door, watching the lights turn on and off, listening to her and Liam's laughter echoing from the living room. The sound was like a knife stabbing at his heart. He stepped back, standing in the dark, feeling like he had been erased from the world. He began to understand that there were secrets that didn't kill us immediately, but gnawed at us every night, every second. He couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, his mind haunted by a single question. If she was truly happy, why hide a life? Time passed, but the memory lived on. Thomas began to paint again, but his paintings were now dark, full of distorted curves. Every brushstroke was a wound. He painted Hope's face, but always erased her eyes, because he couldn't decide if they were the gaze of a lover or a traitor. Douglas saw his father drowning in a dark world, wondering why the once strong man had become so silent. In the dimly lit apartment, Thomas looked out the window, where the darkness mixed with raindrops, the streetlights reflecting off the glass like drops of blood. Hope continued her life with Liam, but her sleep was never complete. In her dreams, she always heard crying faint, distant, as if coming from somewhere not of this world. Every morning, she woke with cold hands, a hollow feeling in her chest, and Thomas's eyes were like a curse. She tried to forget, tried to love Liam as if there had never been a crack, but her mind could never quite escape the image of those eyes, the eyes that had looked at her as if the world were focused on one person. Finn, after all, remained silent, keeping all the files. But he knew that what Thomas discovered did more than destroy a relationship, It opened the door to another truth he wasn't ready to face. In some dark corner of the hospital, a copy of the file still existed, undestroyed, like a monster waiting to rise. Thomas stood in the middle of the empty room, looking at the unfinished painting, the paints blending together to create a bloody red. He understood that there were losses that could not be named, only felt by existing with the pain. Outside, thunder rumbled and rain began to fall, as if the sky itself wanted to wash something away. But he knew that no rain would be strong enough to wash away this sin. The question still echoed in his mind like a curse. If true love existed between him and Hope, could it survive after a life was erased for a wedding ring? Or was all love just an illusion, the most beautiful thing right before it vanished? The morning of Hope's wedding began with a dim light, a light as thin as a veil covering the entire church, where people were waiting to witness a love that was supposed to have a happy ending. White bouquets were carefully arranged along the aisle. The piano played slowly, gently stirring the air. Hope appeared in a pure wedding dress, her face trying to remain calm, but her eyes seemed to carry a storm that was silently writhing inside. Each step she took towards the altar was a step that pressed on her memories, her fears, the silent calls from her conscience that she tried to suppress. Meanwhile, behind her, Thomas was walking in with a face as cold as a chill. No one knew that beneath the neat suit was a heart exploding with pain and obsession. He had waited for this moment, not for revenge, but to pull Hope out of the illusion she was trying to live in, a world where lies were called happiness. Thomas walked across the pews, his gaze piercing Hope, making her feel a cold chill run down her spine. He saw in her eyes no longer innocence, but fear of being exposed. When the priest spoke, the air in the church seemed to freeze. Everyone held their breath, waiting for the couple to say their vows. But before the sound of "I do" could be heard, Thomas took a step forward. The sound of his shoes echoed, strong and decisive, cutting through the music, cutting the sacred space like a knife. All eyes turned to him. Hope paled. Liam turned around, bewildered. No one understood what was happening. Thomas looked straight at her, his voice low, his every breath filled with bitterness. He had nothing left to lose. When the truth was revealed, each word was like a nail hammered into the air. Hope trembled, her whole body frozen. Thomas's words were not just accusations, but the cry of a betrayed person, of someone who loved to the point of despair. He told her about that night, about the feelings he thought were real, about the dream he believed they shared. And then he pressed on what she had been hiding, the child she had chosen to deny, the things she thought no one would ever know. The words were like knives through Hope, leaving her breath hitched, her vision blurred by the murmur of the crowd. Liam stood still, his face changing from surprise to horror to anger to blankness. Hope tried to speak, tried to explain, but no words could save her. She knelt, tears streaming down her cheeks, her trembling hands grasping Liam's, as if to hold onto the last bit of warmth. But his eyes were now cold disappointment. He stepped back, lips pressed together, as if he spoke, everything would crumble. Liam knew his love for her had died the moment she betrayed him. He took a deep breath and said one thing, not to Hope, but to his own life, that he couldn't go on. The wedding ended in chaos, Hope's sobs echoing through the whispers, the cameras, and the church doors slamming shut like a dream. Thomas stood there, staring at the broken scene with empty eyes. He thought he would feel relief, that telling the truth would free him, but instead, there was only a terrible silence. Hope crumbled before him, and Liam turned and walked away without looking back. Thomas realized in a moment that sometimes the truth isn't a light, it's a fire that burns everything, even the one holding it. He walked out of the church, unstoppable, unnamed. The sunlight outside was blinding, but not enough to warm him. He felt like he'd killed something sacred, not just in Hope, but in himself. Hope was left alone, on the cold floor, where petals fell among the tears. She could hear her heart pounding, regret washing over her like a tidal wave. Everything she had tried to hold onto now melted like sand in her hands. She knew that by hiding, she had lost not only Liam, but also the chance at forgiveness. Outside, Thomas walked through the silent crowd, the wind blowing through the trees like a whisper of fate. He didn't look back, but the image of Hope falling was seared into his mind, like a wound that would never heal. As night fell, Thomas drove aimlessly through the empty streets, the streetlights casting long, distorted shadows on the windshield. He wondered if he had been wrong to say it all, or wrong to love someone who had never been sincere in the first place. In the rearview mirror, his image was faint, a ghost of himself. Hope sat in the dark room, her wedding dress crumpled, her hands still clutching the wilted bouquet. She looked in the mirror, saw her face distorted by tears, saw the empty eyes of someone who had just lost everything. The press would call it the failed wedding of the year. People would talk about the scandal, the betrayal, the humiliation exposed to the public. But none of them understood that, deep in the hearts of everyone involved, a wound had opened that could never be closed. Vin heard the news from the nurse and could only sit motionless, his hands clutching a cold cup of coffee. He remembered the moment Thomas came to his room, remembered the look of despair in his eyes, and understood that whether he kept quiet or not, this fate would explode like a time bomb. Hope left the church in the night, her steps dragging on the gravel path, the moonlight shining on her dirty white dress. She felt the cold seep into her heart. A part of her had died. Thomas watched from afar, not daring to get closer, just watching her disappear into the mist like a ghost. A light rain began to fall, mixing with tears, washing away the makeup, but not the sin. He stood still, wondering, is it true that when people tell the truth, they are saving themselves from lies, or simply destroying the last remaining trust? One last image lingered in his mind, the church doors opening, the lights inside fading, and Hope's bouquet falling, blown by the wind, the petals dissolving in the rain, flowing down the stone groove like the blood of a torn heart. And somewhere amid the distant thunder, the unanswered question, can any sin be forgiven when love has turned into